Hi, friends. Ephesians 5 and 6 are challenging. And I just want to name that. I want you to hear it from me. This is tough. It's tough because you and I come in with a whole lot of assumptions and feelings that we import into this passage. And it can feel a little bit backward or out of date or like a cringeworthy part of a letter that you thought was otherwise uplifting and encouraging. And what happened, Paul? How did we go wrong? I want to name that. And I want to challenge us a little bit to recognize that you and I have cultural glasses on. Do you see them? Do you see them? Because the task at hand before us is to take off our cultural glasses as best as we can and to step into first century Greco-Roman society, to Paul's world, and to try and meet Paul on his own terms and understand what he meant by what he said. And that requires a little bit of cultural legwork. There's so much context that's behind all of these dynamics that he's talking about in 5 and 6. And for a lot of that, I would refer you to the email that Alex and I wrote up for this week's readings. If it's not in your inbox already, you can find it linked on our website on the Ephesians Bible Reading Plan page. There is a lot of information here there on what's happening in this section. But right now, I want to take you through one aspect of what's happening in this passage that I think it's not even on our radar. Paul is so smart. If you could not tell from the early chapters of Ephesians on all of his elegant writing and complex metaphors, Paul is so smart. And he is using all sorts of rhetorical devices to make his arguments and to tell stories. And he is doing the exact same thing in chapters 5 and 6 by playing with a literary convention at the time called household codes. In first century Roman society, these would be very common. Literary convention, the philosophers and political figures of the time would often write household codes addressed to patriarchs, giving them instructions on how to order their households so that it would uplift them and make their lives comfortable and bring glory to the emperor. And what's subversive about Paul writing this household code is that he's taking the format and flipping the message entirely on its head. Entirely on its head. People like Aristotle and Josephus wrote household codes, and if you read theirs, they flat out say, women are inferior to men in every way. They say it's right for some men to rule over others, i.e., slavery is justifiable. And they would have only addressed these household codes to patriarchs. In their minds, those were the only people worth addressing. And the whole point was to teach these patriarchs how to, use their authority over their wives and their children and their slaves to make their lives cushy and comfortable and bring them as much glory and success as they could. Do you see how Paul's completely subverting that tradition in this section? Just the fact that he addresses wives, children, and slaves is radical because it attributes dignity and value to them in a society where they are the subjugated parties, where they really don't have many rights. And it means that the communities that Paul is writing to, these house churches that would be reading this letter, There are slaves and children and women among them who are welcomed into the assembly, who would be hearing these words that Paul has to say. I'm guessing that it's not comfortable for us to hear Paul tell slaves to obey their masters. There's a lot of context here on what slavery was like at the time that you can learn about in our email. Slavery was not really ethnically and racially based at the time. It was more of an economic structure at the time. But either way, that doesn't sit well with us, because I think the temptation with this reading for today is to get caught up in what I wish Paul would have said, which is probably just a blanket statement of abolition, calling for slaves to be freed and for social revolution and change. The temptation is to get caught up in what I wish Paul would have said and miss what he is actually saying and how radical and explosive it is. What Paul writes to slaves and masters, especially that last verse to masters, is a stick of dynamite for society then. Because he tells masters to treat their slaves in the same way that their slaves treat them. AKA, he's leveling the playing field. He is creating equality and establishing a new relationship based on brotherhood and their common status as children of God. If you walked away from this passage feeling like Paul might be endorsing slavery or getting behind that hierarchy, man, I really don't want us to misunderstand him. If we want to know what Paul thinks about slavery, I really recommend you check out this letter, the letter to Philemon. It's a very short letter. And if you haven't read this before, I would encourage you, after you watch this video, to take 2 minutes, it's 25 verses, to read this letter. Because in it, Paul is writing to a slave owner whose slave has run away. He's writing to Philemon, and Philemon's slave Onesimus ran away, and Paul established a friendship with Onesimus. He actually writes about Onesimus with really beautiful expressions of love and how Onesimus is just close to his heart. But he's sending Onesimus back to Philemon because he believes strongly that reconciliation between them is important. And I think he wants to teach Philemon a lesson. He says to Philemon, basically, I hope that the fact that Onesimus ran away from you creates an opportunity to do what you probably should have done before. I hope it creates an opportunity for you to welcome him back no longer as your slave. He says, I hope you welcome him back no longer as your bondservant, but as more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother. Paul is breaking down the very basis of slavery and asserting that the ground is level at the foot of the cross because there is no longer slave nor free, nor Jew nor Gentile, nor man nor woman. Onesimus and Philemon are both children of God and new humans, and they're equals. Under the gospel, there is no favoritism with Jesus. He doesn't favor Philemon over Onesimus. And so Paul is making this radical statement to Philemon and saying, you as a slave owner have legal recourse to do whatever you want to Onesimus. But we don't play by the categories of the outside world anymore. We're not playing the hierarchical game. We're not playing the favoritism game anymore, because now you're in the kingdom. And the only categories that count are new human, child of God, brother and sister. And you and Onesimus have that in common. Would you welcome him as such? You have to read it. It's so good. As we wrap up this household code, my prayer for us is that you and I would be able to see how fresh and relevant this is, that this is not actually something that is out of date or backwards or anything like that. What could be more relevant than Paul's call for us to consider all of our relationships, especially the closest ones? What could be more relevant than Paul's call to run all of our relationships through the story of the gospel and to consider what it looks like for me to embody that story in each of them? And so my challenge for you and I is to sit with that call. In our closest relationships, what does it look like for you and I to embody the story of the gospel? In relationships where there are wounds, where you feel tension, what does it look like for you to lean in and be Christ-like? To set aside worldly categories or temptations to feel bitterness and to treat each other as brother and sister. Friends, I hope that you enjoy the rest of this letter to the Ephesians. I will see you soon. Take care.